John, it is a pleasure to have you back here. Thank you for being with us. You were last here 4 years ago. At that stage, you were 4 months into your position at Guardian USA. We were about the same time through the Trump presidency as we are now with the Biden presidency. As Chris said, it has been a tumultuous few years. Your talk at Ireland's Edge foreshadowed very prophetically a lot of what we have since come to live. At this point now in 2021, from this vantage point, what are your reflections?
4 years on, America has endured at 3 more years of a Trump presidency. And I would say that the legacy of that, not least in the violent denouement of the riot on January the 6th, is that my sense is that America is a country that's even less at ease with itself. It feels, even more so than 4 years ago, it feels angrier, it feels more divided, it feels less settled, it feels less bound by common values and common issues to address. And that's not to freight all of that responsibility on 4 years of a Trump presidency, because I think those divisions were becoming apparent long before he took office and were possibly in part responsible for him coming to office. But there's no doubt that he fanned those flames, and it was one of the ugliest, most dishonest, most divisive presidencies in Republican history. And it has left a terrible legacy, I would say. But also within those 4 years since I was last here, one of the most significant events in American public life took place, which was the killing of George Floyd. And it's difficult to underestimate the impact that that has had, at least in starting a conversation about race and racial inequality in America. And that continues to impact public life and impact corporations and certainly news organizations like The Guardian, where we committed 18 months ago to set about to try and completely retool and re-kit our own organization. So in short, I would say it's not a country that seems any happier than it was 4 years ago. And I think the roadmap ahead is challenging.
And as you talked about there, the retooling, the re-kitting of your own organisation, it appears to me that there is a number of themes in the journalism that Guardian USA has chosen to focus on in particular. The question of race intersects with practically every one of them. But it seems to me that one of the key themes that ye have been pursuing is the voting rights and the structuring, the institutional structuring of democracy. In some senses, the dismantling as opposed to the structuring. What has really struck you about that?
Yeah, and I talked to my staff a lot about issues like how unequal the Senate is. I talk a lot about the Supreme Court. And sometimes I feel as though people are less interested in these issues because they seem procedural. But institutions like the Supreme Court and the Senate are at the very heart of the roadblocks to progress in America. And it's really imperative that the country starts a conversation about how they can try and rebuild the fundamentals of American democracy. And without challenging things like the Senate, which we can talk about in a little while, I don't think that will happen. In terms of voting rights, I began to get interested in voting rights about 8 years ago when the Supreme Court gutted the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And what they did was they said that states no longer had to have legislation that pertained to voting rights passed at a federal level. So the Supreme Court absented the federal government from needing to oversee voting rights legislation in individual states. That allowed individual states to introduce the most wild and extreme forms of restricting the vote, almost always to people of colour and marginalised communities. And I remember reading about this, and there wasn't that much to read, but I remember sitting in London before I was ever entertaining the thought of being sent to America and thinking, how can this be happening in plain sight in legislatures across the country, in the place that calls itself the so-called leader of the free world? I mean, I was just astonished. And so when I got to America, one of the first things I did was to say, we are going to do a significant amount of ongoing reporting, not incidental and incremental pieces. We put together a team. We called it the Fight to Vote. And we started that in 2018, 2019, and in many ways prefigured the fights that would take place, particularly around Trump and the last election. And it's fundamental, because if you restrict people from voting, you will restrict their voice and their issues and their challenges from being discussed and debated and represented. And I talked about the legacy of the Trump presidency, and particularly the way that he left, which was to cast doubt on the election and to assert that the election result was fraudulent, and that fraudulence had been built into the voting system. And what that allowed was that, remarkably, having already introduced extreme voting rights restrictions over the previous 5 years, after the last election, just gone, something like 300 bills have been introduced to further restrict voting rights in those states where marginalised communities and people of colour have traditionally been at the receiving end of restrictions such as, reducing the number of polling stations in communities, heightening the level of ID that you need to make a vote. And so that has happened in places like Georgia and Texas and Florida, Ohio, just in the last 6 months. So as an outsider, I wanted us to do work around issues that were impacting communities, but I really wanted to draw attention to the foundations and the systems and the structures that allow those inequalities to continue. And the naked way in which states across the country blatantly restrict the right to vote for mostly marginalised communities, is abhorrent.
Another abhorrence, which again I followed for a period, but if we follow that into the environmental injustice, and how that is becoming how that ties into what we will see and are seeing across climate injustice. Your Cancer Town program in Louisiana, it showed at another level, perhaps informed slightly by the outsider's view as well, this level of environmental crime and living conditions that are generally ignored through but with very limited view. What has that shown you about the structuring of power and influence across? Many of those are company towns, the type of towns that you have done groundwater reporting on, other forms of environmental pollution. You have been very embedded within those communities. But again, there has been much to report on there.
Yes, I mean, you mentioned Cancer Town, and again, I do think that was provoked by, again, a kind of an outsider's view. And I became aware of a town that we called Cancer Town, and we only called it that in dialogue with the residents of Reserve, Louisiana, which is a town of about 4,000 people, majority black town. It's a town where your risk of cancer is 50 times higher than any other town in America. It's the site of a Denka petrochemical plant which emits a carcinogen, or perhaps I should say a likely carcinogen for legal reasons. The Environmental Protection Agency ought to be governing those emissions, but Denka have consistently had emissions over and above the safe level that the EPA allow. And I started reading about this and thought, how can it be in America, again, that there can be a small community where the risk of cancer is 50 times higher than any other town in America, and nothing happens. Denka just went on polluting. The carcinogen keeps being emitted. People keep dying. Nothing happens. One of Biden's principal chief aides in his cabinet is Cedric Richmond, a senator for Louisiana, a Democrat, had never met the campaigners, had never shown any interest in meeting the campaigners. He is somebody who benefits from petrochemical funding. And so that alliance between politics and corporatism in America is built into the very structure. And we decided not to go there for 2 weeks and do a piece and then take off. We decided we would report there for a year, and we've continued to do that. We had public events there. We asked Cedric Richmond to meet the campaigners. We have continued to report 2.5 years later. And 2 weeks ago, Biden's pick for the Environmental Protection Agency, Michael Regan, an African American, went on an environmental justice tour of southern states, Florida, Louisiana, and Texas. And he stopped in Reserve, Louisiana, and he met all the campaigners that we had been writing about. Now, that's not solely the work of The Guardian. Other people have written about it, but I hope that our sustained coverage to say, this is just not right. One of the impacts of our reporting is that the closest place to that plant was a junior school. Now, the executives of Denka certainly didn't send their pupils to that school.
Yeah.
And it's an outrage. And that school has been moved as a result of some of our reporting. The governor has instituted the first ever review of a petrochemical plant in Louisiana. But, for Reserve Louisiana, there are hundreds of other communities. And what we were saying is this is emblematic of a built-in systematic abuse and a marginalization of people who have no leverage on power. And it took Cedric Richmond, 2 years for him to even respond to our request for an interview, which he refused, but we at least were able to do a piece highlighting his lack of engagement. He did subsequently meet those people. And there are communities like that all across the states.
As you say, like the emblematic nature of it, but even if it comes down to something as basic as sanitation and clean water, that's been another.
We've done, we've done a lot on that. And again, I think, as an outsider, you read about somewhere like Lowndes County in Alabama, where residents of the, again, majority black town are suffering from hookworm, which is a disease most usually associated with so-called less developed nations which don't have access to sanitation. We first covered that story 4 years ago because, again, at the heart of America were people who were having raw sewage come through their house, come through their gardens. Nobody was showing any interest in trying to address these fundamental issues. Christine Flowers, who's a magnificent campaigner, started drawing attention to it. We wrote about it, and eventually there was a movement. There was a UN panel in Geneva, which our journalist moderated, and 4 years later Biden appointed Christine Flowers to an environmental justice kind of team that he was building up. But again, there are multiple examples of that. Only 8 weeks ago, we did a story about Benton Harbor in Michigan, Michigan, of course, is the site of the home of Flint, which we have read a lot about. Well, residents of Benton Harbor, majority black town, had higher incidences of lead poisoning in their water than Flint. It was not being reported. They've had bottled water trucked in for the last 3 years. It's close to a majority white town who have fine water. We did a piece on that 6 or 8 weeks ago, and this doesn't always happen, but within 7 or 8 days, MSNBC covered it, credited The Guardian. I was sitting at home one night because I have a sad life, watching CBS Evening News. A 4-minute report on Benton Harbor came on. The Washington Post did a leader article. And the state of Michigan, 3 weeks later, said they would replace all the lead poisoned pipes within 18 months. But, you know, it shouldn't take anyone. It shouldn't take The Guardian. It shouldn't take anyone to have to alert state representatives in Michigan to what is ultimately a race issue. These things are happening and being visited on communities of color all of the time in a way that white communities do not suffer in this way. So, you know, wherever you look, race intersects with all of these issues that we end up talking about, whether it's voting rights, whether it's the way in which the Senate overrepresents low population white states and underrepresents multicultural large states like California, New York, Florida.
And will continue to do so at an increasing impact.
Yeah, and again, you know, you can address issues like Benton Harbor and something good happens sometimes, and you can report on Reserve Louisiana. Yeah. But unless you address these foundational inequalities that drive those inequities, and the Senate is at the heart of those. I mean, the Senate, you know, Wyoming, population 600,000, has 2 senators. California, population 40 million, has 2 senators. That kind of inegalitarian approach to misrepresentation was baked into the Senate from the start. And as the country gets more diverse, it becomes even less representative because that demographic diversity is not spread evenly across the country. And so is the Senate representing Americans or states? There are 50 Democrats and 50 Republicans in the Senate. The 50 Democrats represent 40 million more Americans. I mean, you know, again, I say to my staff all the time, like, please be interested in this, because unless you address those foundational inequalities, it's very difficult to repair the other inequalities downstream.
And John, you and your team, you're reporting on a massive wave of activism, and a huge energy focused on these and other issues. What has struck you about what you're seeing in those movements? Yeah,
and look, I think it's easy, and you feel it when you come back to the UK, where people refer to the US as a irredeemable basket case that's, you know, going to hell in a handcart. And obviously,
says the UK.
Well, the UK and Ireland, and you know, the Trump presidency did much to kind of bake in that narrative, and so you do have to stand back and look at those initiatives and activism and campaigns.
Cities,
mayors across America are introducing climate initiatives that certainly flew in the face of what Trump was attempting to do. But even at a very basic level, 150 million Americans voted in the last election, and 7 million more Americans voted for Biden. Now, the downside is that 71 million had a good look at the ugliest, most divisive, most rancorous president in history and still voted for him. But 7 million more Americans chose a moderate, moral conviction politician.
Yeah.
And there is an amazing work being done by people like Stacey Abrams and the Fair Fight campaign to get the vote out, which had a seismic impact in terms of those 2 Senate runoff elections in Georgia. 2 weeks ago, her political action committee raised $1.4 million to erase the medical debt of 100,000 of the poorest people in Georgia. There's huge activism to try and counter the swathe of restrictive reproductive rights access bills in America. So, I know it's easy to paint a dystopian picture of America, but everywhere there are people organizing and committed to a different America.
Let's move back to the UK for a moment. Before you left, one of the big stories of your final year at The Observer was the Cambridge Analytica story. And we have had Carol Cadwallader here. As you look at that story now, coming up on 5 years on, and the reporting of which all of that was a part, what strikes you now as the enduring importance of that story?
Yeah. Well, let's just remind people that Cambridge Analytica was a company founded by Robert Mercer, a right-wing or possibly even far right-wing donor. On the board was Steve Bannon, one of the most extreme Trump acolytes. And what happened was they harvested data that was not being protected by Facebook, and they harvested it for political ends. I think 5 years ago, that was at the very start of a sense that Facebook and platforms were not protecting data, were running roughshod over other corporate interests in terms of the enormity of their positions in the market, and the impact on journalism is just one of those. And I think 5 years ago, the shine was just about to come off Facebook and the platforms, and it was it had huge impact globally, and it set in train. I think it did set in train a series of events that has meant that Facebook, Google, Amazon have all since been, at least to some extent, called to account. They've now had 3 or 4 sessions in front of Congress in the US, whether that's to do with their inability to curtail misinformation, or the way in which they distort the so-called free market. So I think there was a period 5 years ago where big tech wasn't in the same dystopian place that it is now, and I think Cambridge Analytica was at the start of that. So I don't think we quite recognized how big and how important a story it was, because ultimately it was about safeguards and safeguarding data, which Facebook didn't do, and they've continued to be negligent in all kinds of corporate ways, whether that's failing to curtail misinformation, not just in the States, but in Myanmar, in India, in Brazil, with horrific consequences.
Some devastating consequences. John, you won't always be editor of Guardian USA. You won't be sitting in that seat. You use the words being sent there. You lived much of your life in the UK after you left Ireland. What do you think is the ongoing role which America will play in your own life?
Yeah, you're right. I'm just leasing the Guardian editor role in the US, and I will step away at some point. And I won't be sad to step away, because it is a grueling position if you take seriously the role of an organization like the Guardian, where we are not large enough to cover the waterfront. We can't chase commodity news that all other organizations are doing. And so you decide to set out your stall, and you pick targets where you invest time and energy, and you invest emotion as well. And, if things like inequality and racial injustice and the erosion of democratic norms, if they bother you, it does have a kind of personal impact on you. And all of those things are rife in the States. And so certainly there will come a point where I will step away from that role professionally. Quite what role America plays in my life after that, we will have to wait and see.
Well, we hope you'll be back and tell us, and we hope this weekend will be one of restoration and I wouldn't quite say respite, but let's just say restoration.
Well, it couldn't happen in a better place.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, Muireann.